My task here was, Joe asked me to be, everybody's going to be so optimistic and future-looking, and let's have somebody who's more like pessimistic and looking into what can actually go wrong. So that was my task. So hope I won't bring you down too much. My name is Lotta Moberg. I've done a lot of research on special economic zones. I have a book on the topic called The Political Economy of Special Economic Zones, where I summarize a lot of the ideas and conclusions from the research that I've done on the topic. I am based in Chicago. I work for an investment bank, William Blair, as a macro investor now. But I'm also involved with Refugee Cities, which is an organization with the idea of establishing special economic zones adjacent to refugee camps. So after this talk, anyone who wants to talk to me about special economic zones or macro or anything economics or refugee camps, or basically there's nobody in here has an excuse not to talk to me afterwards. I'm gonna try to keep this short and so that I can leave a little bit for questions and answers, because that's usually appreciated. This is Dominican Republic, actually, but I guess this is what a textile factory could look like in Puerto Rico as well. I've done quite a lot of research in the Dominican Republic, and there's actually some parallels that I'm going to get to here. So very shortly here, special economic zones are great. They can do a lot for an economy. They can increase production. A lot of the goal of a special economic zone is often to increase exports. The government has an idea about how we're going to be more competitive. Let's focus on this area and on this form of production, and we're going to get going. And sometimes it kind of works, and sometimes it kind of doesn't, and sometimes it looks like it works, but it actually is a drain on the economy. And those are the kind of things that I'm hoping that the projects that might be launched in Puerto Rico will actually be looking out for and thinking about the actual costs that are often hidden in special economic zones. Basically what special economic zones are is, in a way, a form of redistribution. If you have an area in one zone, in one part of the country, you may get more international foreign investments, but there's also going to be some kind of movement of capital, labor, and often investments from the rest of the country or for the rest of on an economy to the zones. And those are the kind of things that are underlying this that I think we should keep in mind. How can zones go wrong? I really like that. We had to switch the agenda here a little bit, and I was going to speak later, but it's actually perfect that I'm speaking after Tom Bell, because we have this wet dream about having this battle between us, where I'm going to be the negative person, he's going to be a positive person, it's going to be really fierce. We still haven't done that, but we're kind of getting there a little bit, because there's a lot of things that are promises with zones. There are a lot of things that can also go wrong. I would categorize these in two ways. One is kind of the knowledge problem with zones, and one it would be the incentive problem. The knowledge problem has to do with this. You have a vision for a zone. You have a vision what it should produce. You have a vision for where it should be. However, it actually is very hard often as a planner, who could be a government person, but it could also be a non-government person, to know what is actually a good location. And what we've seen a lot in the past is that governments tend to throw a lot of money on these zones, and at the end of the day, they're gonna look successful, because you're gonna get, if you throw enough money on anything, you're gonna get people going there for some reason. There is kind of a loot to be had there, so to speak. And afterwards, they're going to tell a story about how successful it was. Well, the problem is with that, of course, that there's no cost-benefit thinking there. There's only the benefit thinking, and you can always get benefits. So those are the kind of things that are pitfalls. Incentive problems have to do with whenever you're throwing money at something, there are opportunities for people to benefit from a system. You're going to have people trying to do that. There's often some kind of corruption involved. There's nepotism. There's an opportunity to benefit your uncle and your neighbor getting the good contracts having to do with this. And those are the kind of things that really drain the resources of these projects. So that's kind of thing that we've seen a lot in the past. I would say maybe one good example would be, say, India. India is one country that when you look at the map of India, you see so many zones and it looks great, and wow, they're so entrepreneurial and they have all these zones. And it turns out a lot of these zones are very small, something closer to targeted tax benefits. That is, you can locate wherever and you get a lot of tax benefits. And there's also the problem of corruption in India that is spread into the zones, and where the zones is actually increasing the opportunities for those kind of, what can I do here? Defer, okay. So those are the kind of things that I hope that when zones launch in Puerto Rico, there is, of course, the tax benefit part of it, and it's great, but those are the kind of problems, okay? So how do we do, what should we think about to fix this? It turns out the knowledge problem, sometimes this can be pretty easily fixed by some kind of decentralization that also invokes accountability. And here these kind of fit together in terms of political accountability and decentralization. If you have a democratic system with a political decentralization, you do have an incentive to local policymakers to think about, like, how will this be perceived for the people, in the sense of, if you are just diverting resources from one area to another, that's going to be very obvious to people, and it's really harder, therefore, to do that. As a centralized policymakers, you can say, hey, I'm going to have this zone project right here, and afterwards you're going to have all the camera crews going there, and they're going to take pictures, and then you're going to sit there and you're going to cut the ribbon, and it's going to look awesome, and nobody's going to know that you're actually just moving resources from one place to the other. And that's often what you hear when you read about these stories, like, they made this zone grow and so on. That's kind of often part of the story, at least, behind that. Limited government planning may sound like great and easy to do, but it is actually part of why you need private zone development. And it's interesting, this is a kind of a structure of special economic zones that the World Bank, that have been doing a lot of the special economic zone work, have increasingly come to realize that this is the way to go. That is, if we're going to understand where we want to be, what we should produce, that should be like private, driven by the companies that are actually going to benefit from them. That's how we can get the information. Otherwise, we won't know, right? One good example of resource waste, if you don't do this, you have in the Philippines, you have another, I mean, it's interesting with the Roosevelt Roads, because that's a former military base. In the Philippines, you had the Patan zone, which was also a US military base, and they left and they say, let's make a zone out of this. It's perfect. It's like by this port. So we're going to improve the port so that we can have all these ships coming in, and we're going to build the roads, and they built all this infrastructure. It was so expensive, and it turned out that you just didn't have enough investors, and that was actually a time when they recognized that was a problem, that they didn't have enough capital coming in to actually justify the whole project. It was so expensive, and of course, the Philippines had to pay for it. And now, if you look at the zone, they're painting it as a success story, because in the end of it, they kept throwing money at it, and at the end, you get a zone that is happening. But if you look back in the history of a zone like that, it's hard to say that it's actually justified to spend all the money on it. Private zone development is actually something that is both a cure, so to speak, for the knowledge problem and the incentive problem. That is, on the knowledge problem side, you need information about where to go. The private investors can lead you there. Incentive problem, if you don't have the opportunity for a person in the government to say, hey, who wants this contract, who wants that contract, but it actually goes through private developers. Private developers don't have an incentive to, they won't benefit from making those deals, right? They have to give up whatever rents they're giving to somebody else. So you don't have that kind of, you tend not to have that kind of waste. And if that kind of project fails, then it's the developer, it's the private business, and not the taxpayers of the country that actually loses out on that. So thinking about then what actually are the lessons from Puerto Rico that we've seen a little bit in the past here. Fiscal incentives is one big part that people think about when you think about zones. That's great, right? That's how you can get an economy going. And it is, in a way, like if you're thinking about what Puerto Rico has enjoyed, you have the 936 Act and all that. The pharmaceutical industry in Puerto Rico has a lot to thank for the tax benefit that they enjoyed. And what's interesting here is it's very well connected to Dominican Republic, where I did a lot of my field research. It started out with these companies, the medical equipment manufacturing companies and the pharmaceutical companies. What they would do basically was to say, Puerto Rico is where we want our more sophisticated production, and we're going to leave the simpler stuff to these kind of lower level Dominicans. And they made like intravenous sets and stuff like that. Increasingly though, what happens was when Puerto Rico lost out on a lot of their tax advantages, what you saw more and more was a more sophisticated production in Dominican Republic. And exactly what was happening was that they were coming over from Puerto Rico, so they were setting up more of those productions. I went to a plant that was making these kind of needles, which is really, really hard process. And that was something that they said, this we would have been done in Puerto Rico before. And now we're doing it in Dominican Republic because we're not seeing that benefit anymore. So it's a little bit like you can get economic development through just looking at the fiscal side. However, if you lose that, it also is kind of loose-footed, so to say. It can also go away pretty easily, and that's a little bit of the story that I perceived when I was going there. So we touched on that before. So a little bit of the things here, people have been talking about this and stealing all the thunder. So I will go this quickly. I would say also, if you think about the fiscal side on one hand, and on the rules and regulation side on the other, really like the benefits of most zones where you actually see growth happening. If you think about the Chinese zones that Tom was talking about, there's a fiscal side to it, but a lot of that was opening up to trade, opening up for foreign investors, changing the rules. That's what fundamentally will change an economy. And that's where zones can be really, really effective. You can do things that are politically impossible in the rest of the country and do it in a small scale and get it going there and show everybody, but here it works. Actually, you don't have that much to lose from this, so let's try it out. And of course, some of the things that has been touched upon throughout this conference is things like the U.S. minimum wage, Jones Act, property rights an issue, and we've heard people talking about the solutions for that. So those are the kind of things that, in my mind, will really lift Puerto Rico. There are things you can do on the fiscal side that lowers cost, but these are the kind of things that can really get it going. I know I am really not, this is, doing business again, people talked about this. Now, we've seen some numbers. I wanted to compare it with the US, because it's one of these things. It's helpful that they do this, right? Like they do it for countries, but here they break it out between Puerto Rico and the US as a whole, and it's interesting to see these discrepancies. These are the ranks. So if you're higher, that's worse. And think about it as in roughly out of 200. And as been pointed out, like, where is this coming from? Like, we're all paying tax in the same country. How can it be so much more complicated? There are a lot of these things that I don't know. I haven't had a time to look into each area here. But the enforcing contracts thing, registering property, we talked about property rights. This is not like a joke. This is like a huge difference. And as been mentioned before too, Puerto Rico is behind Mexico in aggregate in this index. Dealing with construction permit, we have, for example, the US being 33-ish, whereas Puerto Rico is almost 140 in rank. So those are the kind of things, like, it's obvious that there are regulatory things here to do, and that's what I'm hoping that when we set up zones in Puerto Rico, those are the kind of things to focus on, because that's really what should, in the end, make a difference. Okay, so I have a couple of minutes left. Thank you so much for listening, and check out my book if you're interested. I have a copy with me if you want to look it through it. And with that time, a couple of questions. I'm sure I have time for. Yes, in the back. No, they're in 3 levels. I don't know all the details, but you have, for example, you have first of all the foreign trade zones, which is what you have throughout the United States. You already have, I think it's 4 of those in Puerto Rico, 3, thank you. But then there are in the United States ways to get on the state level and municipal level. From what I know, I haven't heard about any of that in Puerto Rico. So if anybody here knows that's actually something that is happening already. But I would guess that a lot of the projects that people are pondering now would possibly be something that you could do on the state level, if that works, as in so to speak, for Puerto Rico. One thing that has been talked about too are these promise zones, which is just another version of enterprise zones. You have similar things like this in the past. This is a federal level kind of zone, and this is very much one of the criteria here is that you have to have high enough unemployment and things like that. It's clearly not a way to target the most promising areas. It's a way to target the least promising areas as a way of redistribution. And those are the kind of policies that I don't think are very promising. And that's a federal level one as well. I think the complex of what levels and what different things, there's more to look into that.
So I've noticed that both the previous speaker and you suggest minimum wage difference as something that could help with spur economic growth. But I also know that realistically that's just likely not going to happen because the governor, in fact, the current administration's plan is to raise minimum wage. They tried reducing the minimum wage a while ago, and there was a lot of public opposition. So it just seems like unrealistic to happen. Do you think that within special economic zones, thinking about like very different ideas such as UBI or wage subsidies, do you think Puerto Rico could be the place where we try that in the United States for the first time?
Just because you have UBI doesn't mean that you're not going to still have the minimum wage. So if you think that that's more politically feasible to have UBI and then say, oh, we're gonna lower the minimum wage if we can have UBI, I'm not sure if that's more politically sellable, so to speak. But it could be, a way to go. I think that you're pointing to where special economic zones can actually be the way to do it. However, in the sense that you can frame it as we're just going to do it in this very small space. Like if you go in here to work, we're going to actually allow a lower minimum wage. And of course, the problem with the minimum wage being the same as in the rest of the United States in Puerto Rico is, of course, that if you compare it to the GDP, it becomes just much more impactful, both on the good side in the sense, but on the bad side in the sense of making it really expensive to hire people. So I do think that special economic zones can be something there, and any really innovative policy that could actually be feasible. I think that UBI, the hard part of that is also that then you're gonna, ideally it works better. I should actually define it, universal basic income, having to do with instead of, in my mind it has to do instead of a whole complex of wealth benefits, you should just give everybody the same amount of money, no questions asked, regardless of your income. If you're rich, it's going to matter less to you, but we're not going to have all this bureaucracy and corruption around it. And that might be an interesting thing to do. It might be hard to get rid of the welfare side at the same time, for zone employees particularly, but yeah, something to be discussed. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, I don't have time, thank you.